Hi there. My name is Dr. Tim Gravoy. I'm the Executive Director of TGS Educational Consulting, and my pronouns are he, him, his. I'm really excited that you're here for this session on leading effective adult learning. Now, one of the things that you'll see is that up at the top, there's an invitation to join a website. That's not going to work the same way that it would in an online session, simply because we're on a video right now and we're not here to do the interactive parts of the presentation. But we are going to stop at the interactive slides and at least interact with the slides in a way that we can think about it inside our heads and inside our hearts as well. But I'm very glad that you're here, and I absolutely know that this is going to be a useful time for us to spend together. One of the things that I like to do at the start is just to get a sense of who might be participating in this kind of session right now. And so one of the questions that I'll ask at the live session is, I'm in charge of some kind of adult learning right now. And it's neat to see, some folks say yes, some folks say no, and then some folks say not yet. And the reason why I asked this particular question isn't because, oh, yes, everybody should be yes, or everybody should be not yet, or anything like that. It's just to note that there's different kinds of positions that we might be in as we take a look at this content together. We're all kind of looking at the same thing from a different perspective, and it's neat to see that come alive in the data here. It's one of the reasons why I like Mentimeter, because it helps to see that data come alive in honestly just live, actually. But since we're not going to be doing this live, we're doing this in a video session. One of the things I'd like you to do is take a breath if you like and just think, where would you place yourself in this particular continuum? Yes, no, not yet. Thank you so much for already getting started with this engagement in our learning together. Let's take a look at the rest of our content together now. Before we get started, I just want to share a little bit about myself and just to help you give a sense of who I am personally, besides somebody who leads professional learning. This starting in the upper left, this is a picture of my family. This is me. This is my oldest. She's 13. These are my twins. They are 7 years old. It's my partner, LaShawn, and this is a dear friend of ours, Adam. We spent a lot of time in Sabino Canyon. So if you're from the Tucson area, you know that Sabino Canyon is a very popular place to be outdoors and to hike and to be close to nature. It's a beautiful, beautiful place to be and a great place to take families to for sure. And we definitely love to spend some time outside. And what I love about this picture is my oldest, who's 13, doesn't usually like to be in photos very much, but she absolutely loved being in this particular one, and it just was nice to see. This is a picture of the lower picture right here is a picture of Valentine's Day. My partner LaShawn and I, we had a nice Valentine's Day dinner to ourselves. It was really nice. But then our friend Enzo, and that's Enzo right here, his birthday is on Valentine's Day. And so, just sometimes his birthday can get a bit lost in the shuffle. So it was nice for us to celebrate Enzo's birthday at this like disco dance party that happened at a venue here in Tucson. It was a lot of fun. And so that's Enzo, our friend. That is our friend Adam. And this is Enzo's sister Ashley right here. And it was just a ton of fun. A ton of fun to spend some time that way together and to celebrate Enzo on his birthday, on his actual birthday for a change. This is a group of teachers that are just a lot of fun to hang out with. There's 3 of them anyway. And this is actually part of a session that I do as part of the series on creating inclusive classrooms for students with ADHD. Now, one of the best, most evidence-based interventions we have for students with ADHD that we can implement right away is time outdoors and physical activity. And so what we get to do as part of this particular session is we're going to go outside. We're going to take some time outdoors. We're going to explore our campus in a new way. So instead of looking at slides, we'll take our cell phones and we're going to go on a scavenger hunt and take selfies in different places that we could use for adult learning during instructional time. It's always a lot of fun, and we end up getting this huge collage together of all the pictures at the end, and it's just a really joyful session. And one of the things that I definitely encourage us all to think about as we design adult learning is, what can we do to make the learning itself look like what it is that we're hoping to see? So, for example, if we're wanting to see more hands-on project-based learning, things like that, what can we do in our PD sessions to make the learning feel like that and look like that, so people have an experience of what it could be, so it's much easier to live out loud once we've already kind of taken down some of the initial barriers there might be to putting some new stuff in practice. The next picture right here is, if you've been going to sessions with me for a while, you know that I am a Kane Brown fan. So here is your a Kane Brown update. Kane Brown just had started his new tour last weekend in San Diego. It was his very first tour date. My partner LaShawn gave me as a Christmas present 2 amazing seats to this concert, and it was just such a pleasure to have a chance to see one of my favorite artists in the world perform. And I'll tell you what, I do like country music a lot, but I like country music basically because of Kane Brown. It's just been his music has meant a lot to me, and it was neat to have a chance to see him. So there's your Kane Brown update for this particular session. And then we weren't ready to go home yet, so we spent the next couple of days just in San Diego. And one of those days, there was the Cherry Blossom Festival at the Japanese Friendship Garden, and it just was cherry blossoms mean a lot to LaShawn. It's just his favorite flower, and it's not something that's is super easy to come by here in Tucson, Arizona, where we live. So it just was a wonderful thing to get to do together, just to go see the Cherry Blossom Festival at the Japanese Friendship Garden, which is in San Diego next to Balboa Park. So there's a little bit about me, and just the folks that are always on my mind and on my heart, and I hope just as we get to know each other, whether we ever get to be together in the same space or whether we get to know each other digitally, I absolutely would just love the chance to see some of these photos of the people that mean something to you when it feels right to do. Again, that's an invitation, never an expectation to do. Now, what I also like to do is when we're together and we're all doing this learning together, I'll pose this question and I'll say, what's on your mind and what's on your heart? And what we'll have a chance to see is usually what happens is different little thought bubbles will come up of just what's on people's minds and on people's hearts. And I'll always explain that what's on your mind and on your heart could be as simple as, oh my goodness, I need to check the mail. I've got a bill to pay. Did I unload the dishwasher? Did I get the oil change? Like those are things that can very much be on our mind and on our heart. That's completely okay. Sometimes it's things like, I can't wait to see my grandbabies this weekend. Or other times it's, I'm just feeling really overwhelmed with a situation in my family or at work or something like that. There was one time somebody even shared with me on the screen that, they almost got into a car accident on the way to the training that they were at. And all of those things are really helpful for me as a facilitator to know because I have a really good sense of what's going on inside the room. I have a really good sense of just beyond the mission of getting the learning done, just who the human beings are and what is on their mind and on their heart right now. And I have a chance to validate that, to see it. Now, what isn't going to happen is I'll never know exactly who it is. There's always anonymous for sure. And so unless somebody says, hi, I am Dr. Tim, and this is what's on my mind and on my heart, I never really know that. But I don't exactly need to know exactly who it is. And honestly, in terms of creating a safe space to be vulnerable, it makes a lot of sense to keep it anonymous. And the other thing to share is just in stepping off the stage for a second, it's a lot easier for folks to engage this particular slide and this kind of thinking when I've already told some stories about, who I am as a human being, when I've already shared a bit about what's on my mind and on my heart through the photos in the last slide. So just stepping off the stage a bit, I just want to share this another kind of thing that's important to think about. If we want to create safe spaces for people to engage in work where, it might be new, they might not necessarily be super good at it or feel like they're very good at it or competent at it right now, modeling that vulnerability at the outset in very genuine and generous ways is very important. And one good strategy that I found to do that is with photographs. Now, speaking of this slide, we won't be able to put the thought bubbles up anonymously, but if you'd like, perhaps take a breath and maybe just kind of notice what might be on your mind, what might be on your heart. If it feels like something you might want to write down on a Post-it note, feel free to pause the video so you can. But it's also completely okay to just engage that in your mind and in your heart. It doesn't necessarily need to come out loud. And that's an important thing to remember as well. And thank you for that. And I hope that opportunity to pause felt good for you and was supportive. Talking specifically about the content for today, this should have been in a handout that was emailed to you. These are the principles of adult learning. The principles of adult learning are many, many, many more than the 4 that I'm outlining today. But these are the 4 that I think are really important for us to master, especially as we think about, most of us work in school districts or in school buildings or work with educators in some kind of capacity. These tend to be where I believe we have the most opportunity to improve what is current practice in professional learning for educators. So when we're thinking about autonomy, we're trying our best to remember that adults are self-directed learners, and we really do value having control over our learning journey, which includes setting our own goals, choosing our own, methods of implementing this stuff and living it out loud, and having our own time and space to reflect on outcomes. And so, yes, there's a certain element of communal learning that happens when we're in PD, but Also, there's a very important individual element of how we live this out loud as individual educators, when we go back to our classrooms or our school buildings or wherever our place of practice happens to be, depending on our role in the organization. And so, some ways that we can really think about autonomy are to encourage choice in professional development activities. And so, one of the things that I'll often always share is I love it when people participate in the Mentimeter and we have lots of engagement, but I'll always share that it's fine if people don't necessarily want to do it right then and there. It's all right. It really is. The other thing that I'll sometimes think about is, that a lot of the professional learning that we're used to in school districts and in school buildings tends to favor more extroverted kinds of engagement. Like we're looking for like think, pair, share activities where we're going to have to talk. We're looking at small group activities. We're looking at table work, as those kinds of strategies. And they're great. We don't need to necessarily lose them, but we can also think about ways where we can honor more introverted kinds of engagements too, because we can engage things in the sense of we're going to work on something collaboratively at a table. We're going to put it on chart paper and then share it to the larger group. That's one kind of engagement. But another kind of engagement is the learner who's listening, thinking, reflecting, considering how they feel about it, thinking how they might get started with some of those things. Those more introverted inside kinds of learning are also important. And there needs to be some autonomy within the way that we design PD so that that whole range of learning experiences can be respected. The next principle of adult learning that we can think about, especially for those of us who lead learning in school districts and school kind of environments, is relevance. So the relevance is very important, and it tends to be something that gets missed because the idea of relevance really is that adults are motivated to learn when the learning applies directly to the work that we're expecting them to do. Now, the thing is that me as a school principal or as a superintendent or as a director of curriculum or any of those kinds of positions, we got to those positions because we are good educators, because we know the craft inside and out. But just because we are good at our jobs doesn't necessarily mean that we can know what is going to be relevant in every single room. And so simply saying that something is relevant because we believe that it is, or because we believe it's a good idea, is not going to be enough for teachers to agree with us that it's relevant. And if a teacher is lost on why this is relevant for them, then they are genuinely lost. And it is not the teacher's job to make something relevant. It is our job as a leader of the learning to scaffold that, to design the learning such that the relevance comes alive, that the relevance becomes obvious as part of the learning. And so that's just a thing to think about when it comes to relevance. And so one of the things that I would really add as we think about relevance here is that we need to know the difference between the leader and the end user of whatever kind of learning it is that we're doing. So, for example, like very often a superintendent might give me a call and we might talk about positive behavior intervention and supports training that they'd like to do for their schools or offer for a certain school even. And they've got a very clear goal or a set of outcomes that they would like to see. Sometimes those outcomes are different than the people that are actually working in that building. And they can be aligned, they can be parallel, but it's important to know that if there is a difference between the two, that we as the people designing the learning there are going to have to design it in such a way that the person who actually needs to live this learning out loud is going to see that relevance firsthand. And so just, as we're thinking about, especially like if you're in charge of adult learning and you're kind of in between the central office and schools, or if you happen to be a principal especially, this is almost always what happens. There's goals for what the person who has tasked you with leading the learning has, but then we've also got to make sure it connects with the goals of the people who need to live that learning out loud, whether it's your office managers, whether it's your parapros, whether it's classroom teachers, whoever it is. We need to kind of know the difference between the person who's asked us to lead the learning and the people who need to do the learning and live it out loud in terms of relevance. Now, the next principle of adult learning is emotion. It's one of those things where it seems like we would be better as educators than we often are at connecting with feelings. And feelings are a very important part of learning. When we feel good about what we're learning, it tends to stick a little bit better. When we've got a strong emotion attached to the learning, whether it's an intense positive feeling or an intense negative feeling, sometimes that intensity of that feeling itself can help anchor that learning into long-term memory so much better than simply, here's your slides, here's your content, let's give it a try, okay, I'll see you next week. And so it is important to really help the learners connect with how they are feeling and why, or how students might be feeling and why. And so, I'm thinking about the course series that I often do on supporting students with anxiety. This is a really important one. So oftentimes people who've never really felt anxiety have a hard time understanding the physical symptoms of fear that can happen in certain kinds of events that aren't triggered the same way for neurotypical folks. And so a lot of times those feelings of anxiety get dismissed or often even patronized a bit in ways that we aren't necessarily meaning to do, but it can happen if we don't necessarily understand. And so one of the strategies that's been suggested to me from other folks participating in this is to be very, very clear about what anxiety feels like, and to find examples of that are going to connect with educators that maybe haven't experienced that necessarily. And at that emotional level, that's really important for that learning. And it's going to be important to bring that into the learning so that learning sticks, and our kids who experience anxiety, you have an inclusive learning space and a safe place to learn and grow. The last principle of adult learning that we have an opportunity to grow in, especially for those of us who lead adult learning in schools, is experience. Now, experience might seem like it's a bit connected to relevance, but it's different. Experience really is how can we respect where our learners are already at in this. And so there's two kind of competing ideas that we've got when we talk about experience as a principle of adult learning. One is we don't want to assume that anybody has ever had a chance to be good at anything that we're leading in this particular professional development session. We want to assume that no matter where you are at, even if your experience level is 0 at this, that you're going to leave this session ready to do something, But then at the same time, we also have to acknowledge that many people are probably at the level where they could teach most of this content before we even get there. And so this happens a lot for the sessions that I lead on behavior interventions, on self-care and wellness, on just behavior supports and things like that. Especially when we're talking about ADHD or anxiety, there's lots of folks that have lots of lived out loud experience with all of those things. And we have to design the learning so that folks that have gobs and gobs of experience in these areas also are going to learn something from the content that we have to lead. It's basically just the key principles of differentiated instruction applied to adults, because adults deserve the same kind of authentic experiences that we want for students, and we need to learn how to model that in our adult learning as well. Now, you'll see in the handout that you got, a lot of these are explained in greater detail as well. And just as you think about how you might want to implement some of these things, my recommendation is, if you feel ready to address all 4 in the next adult learning session that you've got, go for it. Give it a try. I'm excited to see you live all of these things out loud in a really big way if you feel ready to do that. But if that's not necessarily where you're at, and you're really thinking, I don't know, this all seems like a lot of stuff you just talked about. That was a lot of words, Dr. Tim. It is okay to pick just one of those things. Think about autonomy. How can we offer voice and choice inside the learning? How could it be that we can approach learning through different kinds of activities that people have a chance to choose their journey just a little bit? How can we keep those journeys equitable so we're not asking people to choose more work or less work? But how can we give some kind of choice with that? Maybe it's relevance. You want to make sure the learning is sticking in ways that are genuinely connected to the people that you care about. Maybe you want to, find a photo that evokes some kind of feeling and talk about it a bit. If it's not necessarily a personal photo, maybe it's a photo that conveys a certain kind of feeling that connects with the content that you've got. Maybe you just want to make sure that you're differentiated the learning somehow, so that all different kinds of experiences and levels of experience are honored in some kind of way. Wherever you choose to get started is going to be exactly right, and I just can't wait to see how you live it out loud and how it goes. All right, so those are like key kind of philosophical principles that are sort of way up here that we think about. But okay, now is actually time to plan something. You have a Wednesday PD coming up, or a Thursday half day, or whatever it might be in your particular learning space. We got to design the learning now, right? What are the ingredients of that lesson plan, so to speak? Now, I got to be honest. There is a template that I got emailed out to you, and I hope you find it useful. It's an abbreviated version of Wiggins and McTighe's Understanding by Design unit planner. Yeah, but I have to be honest. I don't necessarily know that everybody needs to have a template filled out before every single professional development session. There's many teachers who can plan amazing learning with a big post-it like this. Now, sometimes it is helpful to think through all of these things in order, and especially if you haven't had a chance to think about it in a while. And so we'll go ahead and we'll talk about what the ingredients of this template are. The first thing is actually really, what are we learning? What is it that I am asking anybody to show up and listen to me talk about? What is it exactly that we hope that people can live out loud when they're done with this particular learning? And the clearer that we can be on that, the easier that the rest of this is going to be as well. And sometimes, though, I just do want to caution that sometimes we start out with an idea of what, but then as we think about some of the other things, the what changes a bit. And so it's okay to kind of go back and revise and tinker with that what as we think about the rest of it, so long as we are sure that we've got a good idea of what we're asking people to come together for. Right. So that's the what. The next part of the WHERE acronym is hook and hold. Hook is, how am I going to get people's attention from the very beginning? And then how are we going to hold attention throughout the learning? I like Mentimeter. It's a great tool for that. There's a lot of interactive features of that we can have folks have lots of opportunities to respond. And those opportunities to respond are a key feature of how we can hold engagement, hold attention. When we're asking people to think and respond to their thinking in ways that are safe and easy to access. And then the hook, I really think thinking about emotion is going to be a really big part of that. How can we connect with feelings in some kind of way? And what can we do to make it a little bit weird? What can we do to make it a bit weird? And some ways we can make it weird are by sometimes you're talking about something that everybody knows needs to grow and change in some kind of way, and finally addressing it. Some ways that we can make things weird are to just offer some counter examples to stuff that's commonly accepted. Exploring those can be really neat ways to hook attention and even to hold it throughout. The next letter in the acronym is E, and that's equip. What are we doing to equip the people, the colleagues that we care about, to live out loud the learning that we're doing? And so equip really refers to specifically when I think about what educators are going to do when they're in front of me or with me or watching this video. What are we doing that's going to equip people to live this content out loud? And so for this particular session on leading adult learning, one of the ways that we equip people is I'm trying to do this anyway, and I'm actually really curious to see how well it's working, is to model some of that for you. And so that's, by using photographs to showcase vulnerability a bit, to talk about some social emotional check-ins by with that slide where we're asking folks, what's on your mind and not on your heart, and just reminding folks that how do we create safety? Well, we create safety with anonymity. That kind of slide doesn't work if we're asking people to raise hands and share. It makes sense to do it in an anonymous kind of way. And so we're thinking about what can we do to equip people such that when we are done, folks will be able to get started with at least something. So that way we don't just come to PD and say, hey, good talk, and live the rest of our lives. That is, we come to PD ready to learn a thing so that we can do the thing as we leave. The next one is R, and that's revise and rethink. Very often there's content that seems very clear to us because we're the experts in the content, or we happen to know that particular aspect of the content well, and so that's why we were asked to present it to our colleagues for some reason. But a thing that's helpful for us to think about is, what might colleagues commonly get wrong about whatever it is that we're trying to do? Or at least maybe not necessarily wrong, but we can think about it as, what might we want our colleagues to perhaps think about it in a different kind of way? And so one good example of that is when I do trainings in positive behavior interventionist supports. Classic PBIS tends to really emphasize rewards and incentives and extrinsic motivators in a really big way. Most schools, when they're trained in PBIS, are trained to do things that I don't see any evidence for and doesn't seem to be supported by research. And so we can think instead, how can we revise and rethink that recognition system into something that really isn't about giving kids stuff in exchange for positive behavior. We're not training our students the same way we might train a pet. But what could we do to recognize students for the good that they bring to school? What could we do to say thank you in ways that are genuine and generous, that don't necessarily involve a transaction, that aren't really monetizing this praise? And so thinking about that ahead of time is really helpful, because if we don't, we might find ourselves in a situation where we're training on something, not realizing that everybody in the room has a very different idea about what it is that we're trying to do. And so if we can think ahead of time and name out loud those things that we're hoping to revise and rethink, it can really help solidify some of that learning. Now, E stands for evaluate. A lot of times, folks that facilitate professional learning will think about like an exit ticket or a feedback survey or something like that as a way to evaluate how effective the session was. And there definitely are, some uh, ways to use those tools that are very, very useful, both for the facilitator and for the participant as well. And so we want to make sure that, though, that we're designing them in ways that aren't, adding an additional burden beyond the learning that we're already asking them to do. And so one of the ways that we can revise and rethink the evaluation process is to make sure that there is time to do it within the context of the session. So we're not asking teachers to go do something else after the session is over, or complete a different survey, or fill out an exit ticket when they really should be on their way to the cars. So we need to think about the evaluation component of our adult learning sessions such that it's going to be useful for the person who's participating in it, number one, and number two, not something that requires any extra time on their part. This is going to be built into the adult learning that we're designing and leading. Now, I'm including this next section because it's something that folks are often asking me for. And so I want to make sure that this content is relevant, but I also want to make sure that I'm 100% honest with you about how rarely I need to use any of these skills when I'm leading PD. By and large, I don't actually find that teachers resist learning. I don't find that teachers or educators or any paraprofessional or office manager or anybody who gets a paycheck from working for a school district or school system genuinely resist learning things. So when they have some autonomy, when it's relevant, when we're connecting with our emotions, and when their experience is respected. And so long as we can manage those principles well, and are designing learning that's a good use of our time, we're not really going to find a lot of resistance or challenging behaviors come up in the context of PD. Now, it do happen from time to time, and my recommendation is that we find some strategies that allow us to respond to those challenges with confidence, but also with compassion. Because the thing that I think is really important to remember is that if somebody is willing to raise their hand at a staff meeting and ask a question that somehow challenges the process that we're in the middle of right now, it's because they've been listening very carefully, and because they're very highly engaged. It's not because they're disengaged or trying to be disrespectful. It's because we're asking questions in a genuine spirit of wanting to know. Now, that's always going to be the best assumption for us, especially when we're in the moment, because we definitely want to be seen as a confident, competent leader of learning, but also a compassionate person as well. Because it makes sense when we're asking somebody to do something new, something that they haven't had a chance to feel very competent at before, or something that maybe they have tried and it didn't work as well as perhaps we would like for it to. We want to make sure that we're respecting that and honoring that and listening to that and responding with confidence that yes, we are here to support you and we hear you too, but also just compassion, and that it makes sense for people to feel the things that they feel sometimes, especially when things haven't been taught very well in the past. So I'm going to talk about all of these different strategies that we can use, when sometimes, say, somebody wants to challenge some aspect of the learning for us. I'm going to stick with an example of just feeling like whatever it is that we're learning is for a different age group and not for the age group that we happen to be in. And so this will happen to me when I'm talking about creating inclusive classrooms for kids with ADHD. Folks will think about strategies as being, oh no, that's great for high school but not for preschool, or that's great for middle school and not for elementary. And it happens at every age level. Well, it has happened at every age level that I've had a chance to work with. And so I'm going to stick with that particular challenge, which I think is a very appropriate one, by the way, because we definitely want to make sure any strategy we're sharing is developmentally appropriate for the age group of the educators that we're working with, especially if we happen to be in a building that has a very wide age band, for goodness sakes. And so I'm going to just stick with that example throughout all of these. And so the first one is to stay curious and not defensive. And curious can sometimes sound like a question, but often if it sounds like an invitation, it often works a little bit better. And so I'm just going to give this one to you for free. The three most powerful words that help me to stay curious when maybe some of these more challenging moments happen in PD is, oh, tell me more. And if I phrase it like this, like, oh, tell me more. Generally speaking, people are ready to tell more, about whatever their concern might be, and I get all the information that I need to help understand, where the resistance, if there is any, is actually coming from, and then we have a chance to kind of work with that. But I'll tell you what, if I were to say it like this, tell me more. I'm not really curious anymore. I'm just defensive. And so it's important, if we're going to use that strategy, to commit to being curious and not defensive here. The next one is a way that it might work is to acknowledge and then redirect. So I say, you know what? Sometimes you're right. Some of these strategies might not necessarily work for the kids that you teach. And later on in a couple other slides, though, I think we have some strategies that I think might be a little bit more appropriate, and I can't wait to share those with you. Would that be all right? So we've acknowledged the concern, and then we've redirected towards where that concern might be addressed a bit later on. Now, so obviously, we have to make sure that if we're going to do that, we're going to need to redirect towards something that's going to be useful to the teacher. Otherwise, all we've really done is dismiss a legitimate concern, and we never want to do that. The next strategy would be to focus on shared goals. And this, I like this one a lot because I think that I don't care what age we teach, we have so much to learn from teachers of all grade levels. So if you're a high school teacher, go spend some time in a preschool classroom, because there's some strategies there that are just beautiful to see. And I think the same for a kindergarten teacher visiting a middle school. There's just a lot that we can learn from each other at any kind of age level. And so this focus of shared goal strategy helps us kind of think about that in just a little bit. And so if let's say I'm at a K-8 building and a fifth grade teacher says something like, you know what, I think this would work great for kindergarten. I'm not so sure it's going to work so well for me. And what we can do is we might say, you know what, I'll tell you what, ADHD might actually look different at a variety of grades. I think that's absolutely right. And what we're definitely wanting to do right here is to focus on our shared goal of making sure that all of our classrooms are as inclusive as they can possibly be, no matter what grade we happen to be teaching. And so I think it'd be a good idea to maybe just pause right now. We can think, how might the strategy look the same? How might it look different at a variety of grade levels? And so when we can focus on that shared goal, we can see kind of that thread that continues, that no matter how young or old our learners might be, certain things are going to stay the same in terms of what we want for them. We want them to grow. We want them to learn in inclusive, warm, safe spaces. And so we're going to focus on that. And then we have some capacity to see how the strategy might evolve a bit if it needs to. The next one would be to say yes and instead of yes but. Really, this is just, some people say, oh yeah, that sounds like an improv strategy. And it is, but it's not really an improv strategy in that same kind of way, where we're not necessarily playing an improv game with our colleagues by any means. What we're doing is acknowledging and then hopefully inviting a way to build upon the concern into something that gets us to someplace constructive. So sometimes I've seen facilitators really focus more on the yes, but. Like, yes, this originally was a strategy for preschool, but it will totally work in middle school. And that tends to feel very dismissive. But if we can say, yes, this is definitely a strategy that started in a preschool, and there are ways that we see this adapted and grade by grade by grade, so that yeah, it's going to evolve by the time it gets to middle school. But there's some things about it that I think yes can be very useful here. Let's take a look at how some of those might crosswalk just a bit. Let's see how that might work. Now that can be kind of tricky, and it generally only works if you are sure you know the answer to that question. Otherwise, so some other strategies might be a bit more effective here. Sometimes pausing when needed is important. I think just if somebody says something like, we tried this already and it didn't work because my kids are too old for this. Sometimes pausing is just a thing. And we don't necessarily have to respond just yet. And sometimes it may taking a breath or two and just saying, you know what, I think that's an idea that's worth a little bit of thought. Let's think about that a bit. And if you don't mind, I'm going to look into this just a bit and see how we might expand the thinking. When we come back to talk about this more next week. Pausing when needing, I think, is a really good idea. Inviting solutions is a super great idea. You know what? You're right. This isn't going to work the same way for middle school as it does in preschool. This isn't going to work in high school the same way that it does, for elementary students. Or this isn't going to work in a fine arts class the same way that it works for an English language arts class. I'm wondering what have you seen that's kind of like this, but does work for you? And if we can invite some solutions, sometimes we can collaborate towards that. Now, that said, I don't necessarily think it's our teacher's job to solve problems that we haven't thought about. And so if the answer is I'm not really sure right now, then it's okay. We don't necessarily need to prompt it too much more. And I might just acknowledge, you know what, I'm not so sure about it either, but I think it's important that we take a look at it, and I want to do that seriously. Let's let me get back to you on that no later the next week. That for me feels like the most respectful way to invite solutions. Invite solutions. If there's an obvious one, share it, celebrate it. And if there isn't one that's coming to mind right now, let's give it time and space to breathe so we can do our best thinking, and come together around a solution that's going to work for everybody. Because that's obviously how we live learning out loud. We find a solution that's going to work for everybody and individually too. And then the last most important thing is to be real. Sometimes there are PDs that we are required to go to and required to lead and required to facilitate that don't necessarily match something that we value, that don't necessarily, aren't getting implemented in the way that we think makes the most sense, but we are required to do it in whatever fashion we've been told to do it. A lot of times, just being real is the most important thing. Sometimes a teacher might genuinely ask, like, "It's March. Why are we making this big change now? Why not wait until we start a new school year?" And if that's something that you have the capacity to be honest about, just say, to be honest, I don't like making this change in March either. I would prefer to do it in August. It's just not looking like we've got much choice. And so what I would love for us to do is to figure out what can we do to make this as easy and effective as possible, for each other, and most of all for our students. When we're real, when we're honest, that honesty tends to be very disarming, because I wish this weren't true, but we're not always used to that. As educators, we're not always used to getting an honest answer. We're used to getting a very polished answer sometimes, or an answer that doesn't make much sense. And so if we can be real and vulnerable appropriately, very often that can be another good way to respond to some challenges that might come up in PD. Now, I have to be honest, I don't really find that I'm using these strategies very often in when I'm leading PD. And a lot of that is because I work very hard to create a space that's connected. I work really hard to create a space that's respectful. I'm going to do my best to make sure that relevancy isn't something that teachers have to figure out. It's something that comes alive, as part of the learning itself. But sometimes, there's things that I just don't necessarily anticipate, or just background knowledge I didn't necessarily have about, why a particular staff member might not necessarily want to do X, Y, Z, A, B, C, or whatever it is. And it comes out at a PD session. And if you have some strategies that you can sort of commit to ahead of time to respond with confidence and compassion, that can be really helpful towards maintaining the relationship that you want to maintain with the learners in your room, especially if they're people that you see day after day after day. Sometimes it's your folks like me that I see, might be seeing over a course of several weeks, but I'm not necessarily there every day. But if you're a principal or a PD provider that works at the school site that you're supporting, it's going to be really important, even more important, to focus on those relationships, because we don't live learning out loud and try really hard, after we feel disrespected. It's going to be important to respond to these things with confidence and compassion. The other thing is, just like all of the other stuff too, there's 7 different solutions here, because I just think it's good to know that we have a lot of options. But generally speaking, when I'm working with a group, I would say I tend to focus on the stay curious and not defensive, and then the be real part, because those just feel right and natural and authentic for me as a person. It might be that you've got a different strategy that works well for you. Now, another thing to note is that there's 7 different options for responding with confidence and compassion. Now, I include 7 because I just think it's nice to know that we've got a lot of different options. But personally, just as a person who leads PD for a living, I tend to focus more on stay curious, not defensive, and then be real. Those tend to be the ones that feel right for me and feel authentic for me, as an educator and as a person who's helping adults learn and grow. But a lot of other people just have others that they tend to lean on a bit more. And so if you're new to this, it's more important for us to commit to responding with confidence and responding with compassion, and maybe picking one that we know we can do, that we know we're going to be good at, or at least good enough at, rather than trying to memorize all 7 or think about which one is best, because they're all great. They all kind of work. And generally speaking, we pick the ones that work best for us in this kind of thing. The other thing, again, I just can't over communicate this enough. By and large, teachers are not going to resist learning, when we've created a respectful learning environment for them. They're just not. And especially when we've paid attention to the principles of adult learning, and we've paid attention to that WHARE acronym, and we've designed learning that's going to be a good use of their time. by and large, educators can't wait to participate in those kinds of learning experiences. And you're going to be very successful, so long as you start with those foundations. But from time to time, when somebody just like needs to work out a disagreement in a fruitful way, we have some strategies that we can use to respond to them with confidence and compassion at the same time. Okay. Now, just some other final tips I think are important as we think about adult learning. I think, yeah, to be honest, I see far too much chart paper being used in PDs in school districts and schools. It kind of makes sense because it's good. Chart paper is good for making thinking visible, but it's not good for creating like a safe space to make that thinking visible, because we're going to see a person writing a thing down. We're going to know exactly who said what. And there's something about that that makes it very hard for people to engage honestly and safely and vulnerably when there's other tools available to do that. And most of those tools, honestly, are going to be digital. The other thing is, just practically speaking, I don't know that storing all those chart papers is going to make a lot of sense. And by and large, those chart papers tend to just live in somebody's office forever and just take up space in ways that aren't necessarily very helpful. And honestly, the most important reason is that by and large, teachers do not want to walk around a room, at the beginning of the school year and writing things down on chart paper when they've got classrooms to put together and things like that. And so, by and large, I would avoid chart paper activities unless there seriously is no other tool to equip teachers to live out loud the learning that you've got planned for them. The next thing is to just know that practice makes a big difference. Before every single session that I lead, especially if it's content that I haven't presented on before, I'm absolutely going to record myself presenting that. I'm going to project up onto a screen. I'm going to stand in front of it. I'm going to have the camera pointed at me. Not necessarily because I'm going to use that video later, but because it makes it feel like I'm presenting something live when I know that the camera is watching me do that. And it helps me make sure that the things that I've designed are going to work in the order that I think. Especially if there is some kind of table activity that I want teachers to sort or engage, or some kind of thing that we're going to be writing or figuring out or creating together. It's important to just see how those activities actually work when we deliver the directions to do them. And the other thing to note is sometimes we get a chance to practice because, I'm going to do it at this school, then I'll do the same thing at this school, then I'll do it at this school. Just really take advantage of those opportunities to learn and improve if you are lucky enough to be able to have a session that you get to do more than once. And that said, practice is important. Practice makes a very big difference for sure. But I always emphasize that it's important to be genuine over aiming to be perfect. I mean, for goodness sakes, I'll edit this video 142 times and there's going to be a mistake or two that, or an opportunity to improve the content somehow, some way. But the most important thing is for me to be as real as I possibly can with you, to show up for you as a person who genuinely wants to help improve the quality of PD for the amazing teachers across our country, for sure. And genuine matters a whole lot more than perfection here. Teachers don't necessarily expect us to be perfect when we're leading PD, because for goodness sakes, they came from classrooms themselves and they had all sorts of things go right and all sorts of things maybe not go so right. So we're kind of used to, what it means to lead learning. We know that things don't always go to plan, or, maybe the best idea didn't work out as well as we thought. But we always appreciate somebody who can just own it and be real with it and laugh about it. And it just adds a real level of vulnerability and relatability that I think is important for us as we lead professional learning for our colleagues. And then the last one to think about is, what can we do to always add value? And I think that especially when we think about PD that happens in school districts and in schools, we want to think about adding value to the content and also adding value to the experience. Now, specifically with the content, let's never, ever, ever, ever again have the band teacher go to an English language arts PD. We absolutely should not be doing that. Unless the band teacher is genuinely teaching English language arts, we should not be asking them to go to something that doesn't connect with their content. This is a problem we definitely need to solve. We need to make sure that the content is going to add value to the person that we are expecting to show up. Now, the next thing we can think about is the experience. When I think about most of the district-wide summer PDs that I do, it is a district full of teachers who are on hard metal chairs in a giant auditorium somewhere, learning with me for 6.5 hours. I just feel we can do so much better than that. What can we do? If we can't change chairs, can we at least change the snacks? Can we, provide something to make it a more comfortable experience? Can we, add something to surprise and delight? What can we do to add value to both the content and to the experience to make it just fun, to make it respectful, to make it feel like somebody was cared for as part of that experience? And so those are the things that I would say just as final tips beyond just the principles of adult learning and how to respond with confidence and compassion to challenges. Avoid chart paper, practice makes perfect, let's aim for genuine or perfection, and let's always add value to the content and to the experience of the professional learning. Now, just I post a lot about these kinds of things on Instagram, so I would love for you to follow me on Instagram. You certainly don't have to; it's an invitation, not an expectation. And there's a lot of videos there too that you can download and use as part of your adult learning sessions too, if you'd like. And so that's a way for you to kind of continue the conversation. I respond to messages really frequently there, so that's another way for us to keep in touch if you'd like. But the most important thing is just thank you so much for just investing in yourself, for spending some time to just explore what might be an idea or two that helps you lead adult learning more effectively in ways that are more fun for you and enjoyable for you and satisfying for you as well. But most importantly, the thing that I really am grateful for is thank you for considering this time as a chance for us to elevate what teachers across the country are experiencing. And by and large, we have so many opportunities to increase the engagement, to increase the relevancy, to increase the value of the experience. And I can't wait to see you live this out loud in some kind of way. So definitely keep in touch. Definitely let me know how it's going. And in the meantime, may you have as many opportunities to be as good and kind to yourself as you are with those that you serve.